Hey guys, today's story is about a group of players that may have taken some inspiration from Sweeney Todd. So, this story happened almost a decade ago when I was still at university and had been role-playing, both as a player and as a DM, for 5 years or so. My memory on the matter is a little hazy after all these years, but I think I remember the general gist of things. This is the tale of my absolute worst role-playing experience as a game master. Two friends of mine got in touch with me, saying that they were looking for some activity to chill out and wind down with, and asked if I could run a game for the two of them, and a third guy that I didn't know very well. I asked if they would be happy with anything, and they said yes. And given that I didn't have much of a prep time to come up with anything terribly unique for them, I decided that I would run them through a homebrew opening for an adventure game that I had been running for another playgroup recently. And again, they said yes, and I gave them the information that they needed to roleplay their characters, and we agreed to meet in a couple of days for the game. The setup for the game was this. The player characters were all exiled from their former homeland after participating in a failed peasant rebellion, and they had come to this foreign city that was openly hostile and unwelcoming to them. They had managed to secure themselves a crappy house to live in at the slums, and had been lucky enough to score themselves a job at a local portside tavern that was ran by a lecherous old man that treated them poorly and didn't pay them nearly enough, considering how dangerous the place was as a working environment. The place was essentially like the Mos Eisley Cantina, mixed with a whorehouse. The system we used for this was Warhammer Fantasy 2nd Edition, which is a system filled with all kinds of peasant careers. Stuff like cooks, barbers, chimney sweeps, and etc. I forgot what everyone's characters were by their trade, because it was such a long time ago, but I think they were pretty mundane, just lower class characters. Now, this is where I believe most of the problems stemmed from. Essentially, what I wanted to do was to put the player characters in a spot where they weren't attached to their current lives, and where they had nothing to lose. So when the call for adventure would finally come, they would be eager to take it. The idea was that the players would come upon an old treasure map that was in the possession of a filthy pirate that would die in the tavern. Basically, the setup for Treasure Island. But I didn't communicate with them beforehand that this is where I was going to go with it. I wanted the light at the end of the tunnel, the promise for adventure and treasure, to seem all the more brighter when it would finally appear. My guess is that the players thought I was out to just torture them, and got a kick out of watching their characters being put through so much crap, so they already had a very rebellious attitude from the get-go. The session was supposed to be about them acquiring the map and figuring out what it was. The main conflicts were going to be, 1. How would the players deal with the nasty old tavern keeper who would want in on the job, and who would no doubt want to gobble up most of the treasure for himself if it got to that point? Would they keep it a secret from him? And if so, given that the guy was basically the only person of wealth that they knew in this hostile city, how would they fund an expedition to go get the treasure by themselves? And 2, how would the players deal with the dead pirate's former crewmates when they would show up looking for their dead friend who had stolen the map from them? I should have realized right away that there was going to be problems with this game, because there was a lot of weed and alcohol involved. I usually have a couple of beers when I'm DMing to help me relax, but I try to stay relatively sober when I DM to stay on top of things. The other guys had no such restrictions, and we started off the session by me describing to them what was a pretty typical morning for their characters in this new city. They woke up to rainwater falling down on them from a hole in their roof, their muscles aching from the cold and drafty conditions they had to sleep in. And given there wasn't much for them to do at the slums, and because I said that they were feeling hungry, they decided to go to their workplace to take advantage of the only good employee benefit that they were offered over there, a free meal. Given that the guys were already intoxicated and had a short attention span, rather than waiting for the game to get to the hook, they were already looking for completely random passers-by to loot and or murder. I somehow managed to stop this from happening by hinting that the streets were really crowded at the time of day, and they would certainly get into trouble for it. Which, in hindsight, didn't make that much sense since it was raining, but hey, I guess it could have been a busy part of town. They got to the tavern, which was mostly empty given it was relatively early in the day. They said hello to some of the tavern girls and enjoyed their free meal, and enter the owner of the establishment.
Since you maggots are good enough to come here and eat my food, you're good enough to work as well.
I quickly assigned them some menial tasks that the owner wanted them to take care of. I had one of the guys scrub the floor from the previous night's mess, and one of them to act as a bouncer. Not that there were many guys to bounce. Now, the remaining one of the three I put to work at the counter, and this triggered some awful things in him that I didn't foresee. The player in question had been working as a cashier for a while, which is a job that he hated, under a real crappy boss. Apparently, me putting his character in a similar spot was extremely uncomfortable for him, and he went on a full, detached murder hobo mode for the rest of the session. Not that it had been that much better before it either, given that they had already been looking for random targets to mug in the streets. Eventually, I draw their attention to a filthy-looking pirate that walked into the tavern. I went into detail on how this guy looked like he was in really bad shape, physically. Coughing and breathing heavily and looking like he has been on a binge for several days. This was the guy who had stolen the treasure map from his former crew, but the players obviously didn't know this yet. I wasn't even done with my description when the player working the counter announced that he walked behind the dude and attempted to strangle the life out of him. And, in a moment that I'm not too proud of, I snapped at him. I asked him what possibly could motivate his character at that very moment, in front of the tavern owner, tavern girls, and some other customers as witnesses, to kill this man right then and there, in cold blood. After thinking about it and coming to the conclusion that the answer was nothing, he backed off, and we agreed to rewind, and I told them that this guy orders a stiff drink, then downing it greedily and expressing his eagerness to get it on with one of the tavern girls. The owner handled the situation, taking the guy's money and escorting him into a private room with one of the girls. Given that the atmosphere at the table had gone quite tense, we agreed to take a small break here. I went to have a smoke outside, feeling a bit bummed that I was dragged into running a game when the players were apparently just looking for a murder simulator, which is a style of role-playing that I'm not particularly fond of. I tell myself that it's just because they are intoxicated and joking around. So I took a deep breath and decided, screw it, let them play it their way, and head back inside. I tell the players that they hear a scream of terror coming from the private room, and they rush to the scene to discover that the tavern girl was half naked on the bed, pointing at the pirate man lying on the floor, dead from a heart attack. They tell the girl to get out, and after confirming that the guy was indeed dead, two of the players immediately started going through his belongings, as the owner of the tavern entered the room. I forget exactly what I said, but I think the owner was berating them for essentially robbing the customer instead of getting help. Something that rubbed them the wrong way, which was really the intention of that NPC anyways. The one player that wasn't currently in the process of stripping the dead man of all of his belongings snuck up behind the owner and attacked him. Well, that didn't take long, I thought to myself, and called for an attack roll, and it was a hit. Since the owner was caught completely off guard, I told the player that he got an extra damage die, and he rolled really well and tackled the grumpy old man against the wall, snapping his neck and killing him instantly. Now they have another body to loot, and this seemed to make them happy. They basically completely ignored the treasure map, which was the entire point of the game, since they now have a murder to cover up. I was expecting them to close the tavern down for the day and dump the body into the ocean at night, or something as such. But these players came up with something way more horrifying. One of the guys announced that he was going to go to the tavern kitchen and get a butcher knife, and proceeded to chop the body of the owner into pieces. Not only that, but he announced his intention of cooking up the meat and serving it to the customers together with a signature house stew that the place was known for. I called for some rolls, and long story short, they basically managed to do it without anyone catching on. I think they even told me that they would eat some of the stew themselves, to celebrate this great occasion of becoming the new tavern owners. Now, I'm not a squeamish guy, and I've seen players pulling all kinds of crap in games before, but cannibalism is one of those subjects that really turns my stomach. I was feeling sick, and I should have probably just told them that the stuff made me feel uncomfortable, and I didn't want to play anymore. Maybe I was still harboring hopes of being able to salvage this game and get them interested in the map, or maybe I just didn't want the game to have a sour ending, but I decided to keep it going. The next day, a gang of rough-looking pirates showed up at the tavern, asking questions about their former crewmate. They had gathered enough information around town to know that some of the folks had seen him entering this place yesterday, and they were openly asking about the map as well. This was me trying to hint that the map was probably extremely important, and the players came up with a pretty decent cover story on the spot. They told the pirates that the man showed up, had a lengthy conversation about something with the tavern owner, and the two of them sat out together and never came back. They rolled really well on the bluff, and after spending a while looking around the place, the group of pirates left. The players managed to divert their attention enough to keep them away from the back room where they had stored the dead pirate's body, and which was still completely covered in the chopped up owner's blood. The players realized that they should probably do something about the grisly scene in the room and started scrubbing it clean before it really started to stink. The pirates continued their search elsewhere, but they left behind one guy just to keep an eye on the place. The players quickly honed in on him, and 3 against 1, he was quickly dispatched, and he ended up in the stew as well. I think at one point I was numb to the horror of what these guys were doing, and I didn't really have any NPCs that I could logically oppose their actions with either. So all I could do was just to fast forward through most of it. And remember, they weren't only just preparing meals with human flesh, but also serving it to unknowing customers. I basically end up fast-forwarding a couple of days, and the players announced that they would start looking for someone to analyze the map and purchase it from them. Once again, completely ignoring the treasure hunt plot hook. At this point, I decided that I had had enough and proceeded to wrap things up with the following scene. Since the tavern owner had disappeared without notice, some of his friends and relatives had gotten in touch with the city guard, who had launched an investigation. When the guardsmen tasked with the investigation showed up at the tavern, the players were actually ready for it. I forget what they had done about the rest of the tavern workers. Either they had paid them for their silence about the matter from the tavern owner's personal stash that they now had access to, or, more likely with these guys, had intimidated them to keep their mouths shut. Either way, it was a relatively easy task, given that none of the workers had any real love for the old man, and one of these guys even had some sort of forgery skill, and since he had plenty of samples of the tavern owner's handwriting, he had managed to write up a document that basically announced the guy had gone out of town, and had given the PCs temporary control over the establishment until he returned. We actually had a pretty tense scene of the guardsmen going through the tavern, looking for clues and doing interrogations, and the players coming up with semi-convincing lies, backed up by some good bluff rolls. And after some opposed rolls by the guardsmen, I announced, "Okay, the guard leaves and the place is yours, for now." And I essentially wrapped things up with that. I think I was hinting that we would move things forward some other day, but that was a flat-out lie on my part. I honestly had no desire to keep going with the game anymore after the mental stress that I had been put through by these guys. Now, honestly, without the creepy cannibalistic angle, and the complete lack of humanity from any of the player characters, I'm thinking it could have been a pretty decent start of a campaign. A bunch of shady ne'er-do-wells taking over a rough portside tavern. And when the guy they left behind vanished as well, the pirates would certainly figure out that there was something off about the place and come back to do some more digging into the matter. So there was still potential for some cool things to happen with that. I certainly didn't handle things very well as a game master. I should have immediately said that I wasn't okay with some of their actions, and I also should have been more accepting of them not taking the plot hook of the treasure map, instead of trying to feed it to them. But if I learned anything from the experience, it's that I definitely should try to communicate my intentions and expectations for a campaign better before I sit down to play with a group. There needs to be some discussion about the overall tone of the campaign, even at the risk of some spoilers, so that the players don't sit down to play a completely different game than the DM. Also, having more sober players would definitely help. To add to this, even though the system that we used was Warhammer Fantasy, the setting itself was pretty generic, and, to be honest, uninspired, low fantasy homebrew. It could have been any setting really, even in Warhammer where some of these atrocities would be relatively common. They would usually be committed for a reason, either due to savage upbringing, as a terror tactic, or to gain the favor of the Chaos Gods or what have you. What horrified me here was the senselessness of it all. Horrible actions without anything to gain from them. Two of these players also later on wrecked a long-running campaign, where I was a player, and not the DM, that I was rather fond of. They joined that campaign as late additions, and some weeks later, 3 of the 5 players, myself included, just decided to stop playing because we didn't want to deal with them anymore. But that's a whole nother story. Well guys, you've heard of don't drink and drive, well, how about don't drink in D&D? But if you do have a drink, or if your players have a drink, you need to be a little bit more direct as a DM, I think. But besides that, the DM should have called it before they even decided to Sweeney Todd the tavern owner. Them ignoring the treasure map is pretty annoying, and I can understand that as a DM, but you can make do without a plot hook being followed, you know. Just come up with it on the fly, really. But the DM hoping that he could have salvaged it in some way or another with these players was a little bit of a pipe dream. And considering that he's mentioning that 2 of these players joined a campaign that he was in as a player and proceeded to ruin, it really goes to show that hindsight really is 2020. But in any case, that's the end of this story. Hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, have a good one.